wish to begin by extending my thanks to the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate. And I want to begin also by lamenting the fact that it won't be possible to push this motion to a vote today, as tellers from both sides of the argument are required for such a vote to be held. And although I am disappointed that there will be no vote on this matter today, there is nothing at all to prevent the Government from bringing such a vote forward in government time. Indeed, the Parliamentary and Health Services Ombudsman has invited the House to express a view through laying its report before Parliament. So clearly this is something that really needs to happen. I will indeed.
Address the prejudice that was touched on at the Select Committee, DWP Select Committee last week, namely that there has been an element of contributory negligence in that this was not a state secret, it was advertised, it was covered in the newspapers, and that some women who were approaching retirement or early retirement did not take proper notice. Can she knock that on the head?
What I would say to the honourable gentleman is that if he reads the Parliamentary and Health Services Ombudsman report, they make it very clear that the action taken to inform women in the appropriate way that one would expect was not taken, and indeed the DWP was negligent in that regard.
Well said.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and she started off powerfully, as I knew she would, knowing what a huge advocate she is for Waspi women. I think that the honourable gentleman's contribution was very helpful there. It is, does she agree with me, ludicrous for anyone at any point to suggest that people, in this case these women, should have found out about a change to their pension arrangements by happening to read advertisements in the correct newspaper on the correct day. None of us should be planning our lives that way, surely.
Indeed. My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and we know, do we not, that many women impacted found out at the very last possible moment that their retirement age had been raised because they had not been given due notice to make plans in the way that we would all expect, and the DWP has been found to be negligent. And I'll say more about that in just a moment, Mr Deputy Speaker. The issue before us today goes to the heart of our sense of justice and fairness, and the social contract the government of the day has with its citizens. A whole generation of women had their pension age raised without the notice that they are entitled to expect, robbing them not just of tens of thousands of pounds in pension payments, but robbing them of their retirement plans, robbing them of financial peace of mind, robbing them of the contract they believed that they had with the society in which they worked hard, paid their dues, fulfilled their responsibilities, and in which they thought they could enjoy some sort of retirement in later life. After all, they had earned it, had they not. And this social contract is an agreement we all think we should be able to rely upon. But when you tear at the edges of that contract, when you rip it through as though it never existed at all, then what retirement can any of us, should any of us, count on? I have met with a whole range of women campaigning against this state pension inequality, the Waspi women, over a number of years. And of particular note is the Ayrshire Waspi Group and the Cunningham Waspi Group, who represent Waspi women in my constituency of North Ayrshire and Arran, and indeed Waspi women right across Ayrshire. But all the women in the Waspi movement have distinguished themselves by their very effective campaigning against this gross injustice which has been perpetrated upon them. And they have done so in the face of extreme provocation from a government which has been tone deaf to their pleas for justice. I have been inspired by their dignity, their resilience in the face of great financial hardship, their persistence, and indeed the compelling justice of their case. And I know many of the women involved, I know their stories, and I note the hugely helpful insight provided by writer D. Wilde Kearney, author of Not Going Away, who joins us in the public gallery. And Not Going Away is available from all good bookshops. And it outlines the struggles of some of the women involved in this campaign. And I pay tribute to Dee for her work in disseminating this injustice to an even wider audience. And I welcome also all the Waspi women who are now in the public gallery, some of whom have travelled considerable distance to be here today. And they are entitled to have their voices heard and their case answered. When a whole generation of women find themselves victims of injustice on such a grand and heartbreaking scale, those MPs who champion their cause feel the weight of their frustrations, the weight of their hardships, and their profound sense of having been screwed over. And in turn, as MPs, we feel our own frustrations when faced with an intransigent government which refuses to listen and appears wilfully blind to the facts. I will indeed.
I'm very grateful to Ombudsman for giving me on that point of supporting constituents. One of my constituents who we've worked with since 2015 was one of the 6 Ombudsman test cases, and actually the reason I'm not making a speech in today's debate is because I'm meeting the Ombudsman on behalf of my constituent at 2 p.m. But is she not as frustrated? She is frustrated with the government's lack of action so far, but is she not as disappointed and angry as I am at the Labour Party and their refusal to back the Waspi women, despite promising tens of billions in compensation at the last election?
None of the intransigence of the UK government that we've talked about, none of this has distracted from the dignity with which those campaigners have conducted themselves over the long years this swindle has been carried out, and it is indeed a swindle. And I will go back, my honourable gentleman raised a very good point about our disappointment and some would say disgust at the Labour Party's current position, but I will return to that, Mr Deputy Speaker, if I will, in due course to respond to my honourable friend's concerns. After years of marching, lobbying, letter writing, email writing, attending surgeries, after years of tireless campaigning, the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman has finally reported. And that report vindicates the Waspi women. And it highlights the DWP's failure to communicate, which, and I quote, negatively affected complainants' sense of personal autonomy and control over their finances, and that the DWP did not, and I quote, adequately investigate and respond to complaints, and in a damning condemnation highlighted that the DWP, despite all of this, and I quote again, will not take steps to put things right, and that its refusal to do so was, and I quote again, unacceptable. It concluded that, and if you'll indulge me, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll quote again, Parliament needs now to act swiftly and make sure a compensation scheme is established. We think this will provide women with the quickest remedy. This is surely one of the gravest injustices of our time, alongside the contaminated blood scandal and the Horizon scandal. Another example of citizens having things done to them, which in every measure is wrong and unjust. I will indeed.
I commend my honourable friend for securing today's debate, and on behalf of the Midlothian Waspi women, say thank you to her for all the work she's done and all the other members who have contributed to making sure this debate could happen. But does she not agree with me that the fact that these injustices happen over and over and over again just show how out of touch government has become in this place?
One would be forgiven, Mr Deputy Speaker, for thinking of a real disconnect between those who we seek to serve and those who serve. And when that disconnect repeatedly happens and this systematic failure perpetrates such injustice, then it is a very, very bad day for democracy. But the difference in this case between the contaminated blood scandal and the Horizon scandal, both of which were awful injustices. The difference is that in those particular scandals, the government at least appears to wish to take action, albeit very slowly. It appears to wish to make moves to address these injustices. But in this case of changing the state pension age with little or no notice, with the devastating consequences that has brought about, the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman has been moved to say, and I quote again, "It is extremely rare that an organisation that PHSO investigates does not accept and act on recommendations made. But the PHSO has no legal powers to enforce compliance. A failure to comply with the Ombudsman recommendations represents a constitutional gap in protecting citizens' rights who have been failed by a public body and ensuring access to justice. By laying this report, the PHSO has asked the Parliament to intervene to agree a mechanism for remedy and hold government to account for delivering this." So, Mr Deputy Speaker, here we are. We are holding the government to account, whilst the government and the incoming Labour government enjoy a cosy, do-nothing consensus, sacrificing Waspi women on the bonfire of austerity they have built together in a deliberate and conscious way. Yet, for the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman to issue such a statement is unprecedented. But it illustrates just how shocking it is that this government, supported by the loyal opposition, loyal in ways we could only imagine, appears to be trying to ignore, obfuscate and gaslight its way out of this crisis. And it is a crisis if you are one of the women who has been impacted. Now we are in a situation where neither Labour nor the Tories in government have yet even accepted the principle of financial redress for Waspi women. Not even the principle. How do I know this? Because when the Secretary of State made a statement shortly after the long-awaited publication of this report, he made no mention of redress or compensation, but went on instead to list how great it currently is to be a pensioner in the United Kingdom because of the sheer munificence of the UK government. And the Labour Shadow Secretary of State's response to that statement studiously avoided mentioning compensation as well, instead delivering a patronising yet supine eulogy on treating pensioners with dignity. Empty words don't pay bills, and no one is fooled by that nonsense. But we perhaps should not be too surprised, since Labour has a track record of letting women down, particularly working-class women. After all, it's the Labour administration and Glasgow City Council spent £2.5 million of taxpayers' money fighting equal pay claims by female council workers over 10 years. This shows beyond any reasonable doubt just how far Labour was prepared to go to fight equal pay. An incredible waste of public money. But it took an SNP administration in the council in Glasgow to ensure the legal action was stopped, the pay claims settled, and these were treated as a priority by the incoming SNP administration. So we know that Labour has a track record of denying justice to women, so we can't expect much from that quarter, and anybody who does will be disappointed. However, the Waspi women I have spoken to feel particularly betrayed by Labour MPs and MSPs who have spent the last umpteen years posing for photographs, smiling broadly alongside Waspi campaigners, pledging what turned out to be empty words of support, only to abandon them at the very moment they are vindicated by the Ombudsman. Now, the very debate we are having today, Mr Deputy Speaker, was had in the Scottish Parliament last week. Labour MSPs, who are not just members of the Scottish Parliament, of course, but members of the Scottish Branch Office, they abstained as ordered by their high command bosses in London. And they abstained on a motion. Incredibly, they abstained on a motion which called for a higher level of compensation to properly reflect the financial harm that has been suffered by Waspi women. Now, that motion sounds pretty reasonable to me. It sounds pretty reasonable to anybody. The sums mentioned in the Ombudsman report are simply too low. I think most people would agree that. Yep. And it must be considered in the context that the UK Government has saved £181.4 billion purely by raising the state pension age of these women. So it's time to get real, and perhaps the UK Government could examine the private members' bill brought forward by my colleague for Kilmarnock and Loudon, and perhaps go from there. But instead, all we have is silence from both the UK Government and the Labour opposition. Yeah. But, you know, the leader of the opposition in this House himself has benefited from a special law passed in Parliament. And that law, Mr Deputy Speaker, is called the Pensions Increase, open brackets, Pension Scheme for Keir Starmer QC, close brackets, Regulations 2013. And that relates to when he was the Director of Public Prosecutions in England, where his personal pension is protected. It is quite literally one law for him and another law for everybody else, especially if you're a Waspi woman, and more so if you're a working class woman. And it doesn't escape anyone's notice that the Leader of the Opposition is now very silent on the injustice suffered by Waspi women and supports less generous pensions for everyone else. What a brass neck! What shameful hypocrisy! Maybe he's just so cocksure of a thumping Labour majority at the next election that he thinks Waspi women are expendable. Who knows? Meanwhile, around 280,000 Waspi women who have been impacted have died since the start of the Waspi campaign. Around 6,000 have died since the publication of the Ombudsman report. Why is there no urgency to address this issue, this injustice? No wonder Waspi women's impatience and sense of injustice is fast turning into outright fury. Who could blame them? And because of the evasions and misdirections used in previous debates, I wish to say to the Minister, this is not a debate about returning the retirement age back to 60. This is not a debate about the triple lock. It's not a debate about anything except the injustice suffered by women born in the 1950s who have been vindicated by the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. Well, indeed.
Lady, for making way, and I think all of us in this room have spoken to our Waspi women. I have Barbara and Lynn from Hartlepool in here today, and they informed me earlier that actually every 13 minutes a 1950s woman dies. So that 280,000 is growing as we speak.
The Honourable Lady for the point that she makes, and all she does is emphasise how desperately urgent this matter is. And every 13 minutes, a Waspi woman dies, so how many will die while we're having this debate? Another half dozen, who knows? More than that. There are no more hiding places. It is time for swift compensation to be delivered to these women who have already endured far too much hardship and distress. And the redress that they are accorded must reflect that suffering, and there must be no barriers to accessing it for any of the women affected. No one can any longer deny the rightness of their compelling case. It's time to pay up, it's time to deliver. As the Minister and the Labour leadership must surely know by now, these women are not going away. So it is my hope that when the Minister gets to his feet, he will have something meaningful to say to this House today, and all the Waspi women who have already waited too long for justice. Perhaps he can at least set out some kind of time frame when the Government will bring forward redress proposals for those impacted. It is a travesty to drag this injustice out for a moment longer. And I hope the Minister agrees and does the right thing by this generation of women. Or will these women continue to suffer whilst his government pontificates? I hope not. But I will say today to the Minister, and I'll say today to the Waspi women who are here listening both at home and in the public gallery, that the SNP unequivocally stands with you. We will not abandon you as others have done.
Yeah.